tomorrow we discuss why we're called Circassians and why this is the name that kind of sticks to us. And we also have our national day, which is May 21st. Its celebration is often persecuted, as it was demonstrated recently in the case of Adyghe activist Ruslan Gvashev in Sochi. Maybe you've heard of Sochi. This is where the Winter Olympics was in 2014. So he was arrested because Gvashev organized a mass prayer on the Adyghean Day of Remembrance last spring, and as a result he was detained, fined for extremism, and went on a hunger strike. The Adyghean National Day, you can see National Day of Remembrance, that's the proper name of it, Shogwashej in Adyghe, this is how it sounds in our language, is a day of mourning because it's a commemoration of the end of the more than 100 years Circassian, Russo-Caucasian, it's called officially, Russo-Caucasian War, and the victory of the Russian troops over the indigenous people of the Caucasus. This war culminated with a military parade which happened here in Kbada, Red Glade or Krasnaya Polyana in Russian, where Vladimir Putin likes to ski. Literally, of course, he's skiing on the bones of our unburied ancestors. Adyghe are one of the oldest indigenous groups of the northwestern Caucasus, a region which is colonized by Russia until this day. Our language, today unfortunately almost extinct, is related to the languages of Asia Minor, such as the Hattic language. This is the Ruslan Gvashev that I mentioned before, and this is the sacred tulip tree, near which usually these mass prayers or collective prayers take place. So I come to the languages here. So this is an interesting question, where the language comes from and why it's not related to any of Indo-European languages, because linguists still argue what is the origin of this Circassian language and all other tribes, let's say, or language groups, whatever word you prefer to use here. And some of them are completely extinct, like Ubykh people. Ubykh people were completely destroyed, all of them, by the Russian army. The villages were wiped out from earth, and there's only one village left in Turkey today. So the Hattic language was spoken in the Caucasus 4,000–5,000 years ago. Traces of our ancestors can be still found in the remaining monuments. This is an interesting one, which is called Dolmen. Actually, in the Western Caucasus and Northern Western Caucasus, you can still see a lot of these things, and archaeologists still argue what is the point. I mean, what is it? Is it a grave? Or is it a way into a fourth dimension? Or what is it? But these are like places of where we can get energized, let's say. This is an interesting thing. It's a Maikop culture, the Maikop sandstone inscription, arguably with a so-called Ashwa pseudo-hieroglyphic writing system, which is another interesting detail because it shows that my people had something like, it's not alphabetic writing, of course, right? But it's a writing system, it's a literacy system. And then, of course, the Russian colonizers come, and they, one of the first things they did, they banned the use of Arabic alphabet and Latin alphabet and imposed the Russian alphabet by force. And to say and to write in all textbooks that we didn't have any alphabet or didn't have any writing before the Russian came and made us civilized. Adyghean mythology, Adyghean religious beliefs, the Nart epic, which is regarded by many scholars as one of the sources of the ancient Greek mythology, and this is a good example. This is a guy called Sosroko in Adyghean language, and if you know his myth, of course you recognize Prometheus, because this is a guy who brought fire to people. And this is, of course, a quiche version. I just didn't find a proper picture. It's a restaurant in Nalchik, in my native town, which is called Sosruka, and you can dine in his head, actually. But of course, it's, it shows to you how important it is, and it was built in 1970s, the restaurant, and it's still there. So this is one thing. Another is Adyghe ethics, ethical system, ecosophical bioethics, and very interesting symbolically loaded crafts, unique musical principles. Unfortunately, we don't have time now, but tomorrow maybe I'll tell you more about why they're unique, because they're not Oriental principles and not Western. There's something quite different in between, and you can hear it if you know something about music. So all of these have been preserved and passed from generation to generation for many centuries. Here the map you can see that there were multiple Circassian tribes, Kabardin, to which I belong, and they never had an established or well-defined polity in modernity, as, for example, many Amerindians had different kinds of political structures, from specific democracy to something even, I would say, resembling feudal hierarchies. However, on the Western maps, on the 17th century and 18th century maps, in contrast with most Russian ones, of course, we can find Circassia as a subject of international law. It had a territory of over 55,000 square kilometers and a population of at least 3.5 million people. Long before Russia actually invaded the Caucasus, it already had its territorial claims to this land, and therefore developed a specific explanation and rationale for justifying the future Circassian genocide of the 1860s and the subsequent mass exile of Circassians from our motherland to the Ottoman Sultanate and our turning into diasporic stateless nation today. Predictably, Russians claimed the attractive Adyghean territories because the territories are between the Black and Caspian Sea, and Russia as an empire always suffered from not having access to a sea, especially one that connects with Europe, of course, because Russia is obsessed with becoming Europe for many centuries, and has a problem with that and a complex in connection with that. And so that's why the Black Sea was important, and that's why Adyghean people were sacrificed, let's say, right? Because it was interested in the lands, not in the people. Out of the 4 million Adyghe, as a result of the war and the genocide, only 3% remained in the Caucasus. The rest either perished or were exiled to the Ottoman Empire. So as a result, today there's about 7.5 million Adyghe people who mostly reside in Turkey, in Jordan, in Syria, in Israel, in Egypt, in a number of Western and Southern European countries, in Australia, in Canada, in the US, and only about 700,000 remain in the motherland, in the 3 artificially divided republics in the Caucasus. And in the latter case, the detrimental Soviet and today the Russian new imperial modernity have also contributed to the destruction of culture, of language, of memory, of knowledge system, of cosmology, of ethics, and ultimately, I would say, of the human dignity of Circassians who were mentally colonized, very effectively colonized, and lured or sometimes forced into the temptation of the Russian modernization, especially in its Soviet version, which of course meant forgetting the Adyghe belonging. So this history of Circassian forced migration, ethnic cleansing was forgotten, was erased from all official sources in Russia, where they were soon to become a minority in their own land, and we still continue to be today. And in fact, of course, those Circassians who remained in Russia and then in Soviet Union and today remain in the Russian Federation, we have to buy our right to stay at home, so to say. We have to buy this right with a loyalty to the Russian masters, and are often reminded that we are guests and more unwanted guests in our own land, especially in the last 5-6 years when the Russian Federation has started again to apply the assimilation and forced assimilation policies. Those who were not exterminated became the victims of the mass experiment of subsuming human memories and human knowledges. The technologies of such enslavement were becoming more and more skillful, I would say, in the Soviet years, in the Soviet colonial stage, because it was grounded in the infamous Soviet doublethink. On the one hand, we had the demagogic discourse of some kind of boutique multiculturalism, you know, the people's friendship, proletarian internationalism, theatrical Soviet multicultural ways, which were erasing indigenous cosmologies, beliefs, identities, and planting on a simplified and safe set of invented cultural artifacts removed from their context and devoid of their meaning. Unfortunately, this virus of voluntary self-colonization grounded in equating the Russian influence with modernization and a readiness to accept the cheap ethnic national culture, ersatz, we can say ethnic culture conveniently offered by the official multicultural discourses, has very deeply infected my people. In the last decades, and particularly in connection with the Sochi Olympic Games, which attracted international attention to the question of forgotten Circassian genocide, and also have launched the latest cycle of the Russian expansionism and expansionist imperial revivals, there are more and more bottom-up activities, initiatives that emerge among the Circassians in the sphere of epistemic rights, including the right to practice the Adyghe system of knowledge to the younger generation, to preserve and develop the language, and that is very important because the language is really, less and less people can speak it. And part of it is, of course, connected with the Soviet policies when the indigenous language was not taught at school, or it was something that you can choose, or it was not an obligatory subject, and so most of the children, they refused to take it, because if you wanted to get any kind of education, you had to go to a Russian school, of course. And as a result, it was taught more like a foreign language. So no other subjects were taught in a native language, like mathematics or, I don't know, literature. All of it was taught in Russian. And Adyghe was just taught maybe 2 hours a week at most in some village schools. And even that doesn't exist today. And of course, this is very important, as we know. As in case of many other indigenous cultures, the Adyghe were often left with oral forms of transferring the heart to verbalize ethical and existential codes, sometimes materialized through embodied memories and correlations with ancestral or communal bodies. And this is, of course, very tricky because it's not a simple going back to some frozen past, because rather we can say that the past becomes alive here and affects the present, interplaying with the complex history of relations of modernity and its others. What I always have a problem with when people talk about conservation, they talk about conservation of native culture, and I think that mere conservation is not enough because it locks the culture in the archaic essentialist ghetto of some sort. It's more important to put the main features of Circassian cosmology, ethics, aesthetics, a vital element of contemporary Circassian life world, in dialogue with modernity, with other cultures, with especially indigenous cultures, of course. So I should say that the complex local history of the Caucasus can be described as a history of epistemicide and ecocide. The Tsarist colonization, along with its genocidal tendencies and the subsequent massive exile, led to ecological catastrophe in the Caucasus and destroyed the fragile balance of the Caucasus forest garden. And here comes the land-based knowledge, because the forest garden is one of the main things in Circassian cosmology, and bioethics is a symbol of local cosmologies and druidic cults that still exist, and grounded in the premise of the inseparable links and correlations between the world and the humans. The northern and western Caucasus forest gardens were one of the several ancient surviving indigenous forms of fruit breeding in Eurasia, which had blossomed until the Russian colonization, which was accompanied by massive destruction of the forests in the Caucasus, the abandonment of gardens, and the loss of most indigenous fruit varieties. What you can see here is an attempt in Karachevo, Circassia, to revive the forest gardens. They have a project now which is called the Circassian Forest Gardens, and they're trying to bring them back. And this is an example of one of the fruit that grows only there. It's one of the indigenous varieties that is almost lost, of course, today. It's called Adyghe, a Circassian kind of pear. And, well, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into that. Today, I think there is a shift in the Circassian interpretation of independence, and that I find very important. It's a shift from a survival mode on Russian state terms to a much more radical agenda of epistemic, cultural, and existential revival and re-existence on its own terms. And of course, Circassians realize that we have never belonged to the lighter side of modernity. We have always been coded as subhuman, as others, demonized, exoticized, at times lured into this assimilation pattern. And unfortunately, with the coming of neoliberal globalization, nothing actually changed for better, of course, because it just highlighted a different option for the others, that of becoming a commodity. So today I would say that the main dilemma is how to exist between the devil of essentialism and the deep blue sea of commodification. And I will just give you one example that you see here of a successful project that happened recently. It's a project by activist and thinker from the Caucasus, a woman, Lydia Zhirgunova, who just defended a dissertation in Tulane University in the United States about contemporary Circassian writers, women writers. And last year she did this project. Her local Circassian colleagues and her organized the first international educational project for children between ages of 9 and 15 under the tree, or Zherosh, I think this is how it's pronounced in Circassian, which took place in Nalchik. It can be seen as an example of decolonial pedagogy in the Caucasus. The improvised classes in the summer school were held literally under the tree in the park, and this park used to be, before it became a Soviet park, a Circassian forest garden. And so it's very symbolic, of course, coming back to that. And the children were introduced to the basic Circassian concepts and key images, to Circassian notions of nature and people's relations with the indigenous names and stories of the plants, the history of the famous Circassian breed of horses that I'm very partial to, because one of my ancestors actually, I think, was responsible for making this horse breed. Then, of course, traditional musical instruments and melodic principles, the main Circassian crafts and the peculiarities of traditional national costume. All of this was presented in Adyghe language for children, which is crucial, of course, in a situation of this gradual elimination of Circassian language courses from school curricula. And so I see it with some hope. And for that, I don't have time. This is also an interesting example of Circassian designer Madina Losten, who has her studio, and she has a lot of interesting projects of working with historical costumes. But we don't have time for that, so I'm wrapping up now. Negotiating the extremes of assimilation and nationalist essentialism, it's necessary to balance between these forms of silencing, these forms of appropriation, and reinvent various creative strategies of resistance and re-existence. This allows the negated forms and the erased forms of relating to the world somehow re-emerge and trigger a decolonial central response of regaining one's dignity, one's agency, and redesigning a whole world anew. Circassian or any other indigenous people's temporality is quite discordant with the dominant globalization progressivist march. This temporality is non-linear, multi-layered, non-progressivist. The elements of ancient cultures culture and way of life are not marked as some kind of frozen and finished past, as they interpenetrate and reshuffle with contemporary features, escaping the usual logic of either or. Everything exists simultaneously and does not exclude, but rather complements one another in today's Circassian processual and contradictory identification. In the process of re-emergence of Circassian thought and knowledge, a dialogue with other indigenous people is crucial, I think. We all are in need of an altered global response to global coloniality. And this will be an answer from the colonial difference, of course, hopefully a positive, creative, life-asserting re-emergence of Adyghe culture as part of the global movement, part of the global decolonial movement, as another way of being in spite of coloniality and beyond modernity. It should be a coalition, let's say, not of the offended competing in their victimhood, but rather striving to change the logic of this world in such a way that nobody is an other anymore, that there are no victims anymore, that we're all equal, not only on paper but in reality. And hence we have the right to be different and practice pluriversality in this world that consists of multiple interacting and intersecting worlds. So that is my vision, I guess, for today. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for this inspiring presentation. Yes, I just realized that my sister-in-law's mother, she comes from this area, and I don't understand Russian very much. But she talked very much about the gardens.
Yeah, probably
yes.
She comes from one of our people.
Yes, probably. I will try to talk with her again.
Yes.
Try to learn more Russian.
Yeah.
To speak with her. She doesn't speak English.
But you don't know what is her ethnicity?
No, I will ask her.
Okay.
Maybe she told me at that time, but I didn't know about your people.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but and she probably is. I realize now.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And are there any questions?
Yes. Thank you so much for your talk.
Take the mic, please.
Thank you, Madina.
Thank you.
Princess Madina.
Thank you. It was such a wonderful talk. Now, just a small question. So you are now a landless, stateless people. Which country recognises you? Where do you have your passports and your citizenship now?
Well, you see, as I said, there are 3 autonomous republics, as they are called, where the remaining Circassians who stay there live. Thank you. Is Kabardino-Balkaria, Adyghe, and Karacháyevo-Cherkessia. These are artificially created republics within the Russian Federation. And so we are allowed to live as slaves there. It's basically reservations, right? If you just put a right word to it. And I mean, if you take my parents, for example, my father, they were not allowed to even live in cities, because only Russians were allowed to live in the cities, including their own capital, until 1945 or something. So it's on paper it exists, but of course the people are not free to do what they want. And I was showing this guy was arrested there for just going and commemorating because Russia does not agree that there was a genocide, Circassian genocide. The first nation that said yes, we agree with that were Georgians. The Georgian state was the first who, and actually they have a center for the study of Circassian culture in Tbilisi, which is, I mean, really good and hated by Russian authorities, of course. So yeah, there were several attempts also to write to different organizations like UN and other asking them to issue a paper, an official declaration that there was a genocide. But of course Russia does not agree, and I was reading the documents in the early 90s when one of the Circassian lawyers wrote this to the Russian Duma, to parliament. The answer was ridiculous, I mean, very Russian style. They said there were many people who suffered because of Stalinism. Why Circassians should be singled out? So they just refused to see that there was a longer story, and that didn't start with Stalin, that it started much, much before. So yeah, and today the majority of us live in Turkey. I think several million live in Turkey. In Syria there were so many of them, and now because of the war many of them became refugees. In Sweden there are Circassian refugees from Syria. I met them recently in Malmö. So yeah, we're all over the world.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. I, as well, me too. I didn't know this history at all. But I was wondering about in Russia you have this policy of small-numbered peoples instead of indigenous peoples.
Mm-hmm.
So you can keep the numbers down. You have this 50,000 limit. So is there any attempt to be recognized within that system? And another question, is there an international or transnational organization for the Adyghe people?
Well, yeah, the small number people
is important, but I think we don't fit into that because we are still not small enough, let's say, for Russian kind of rationale for that. You have to be nearly extinct to kind of count, you know, and you know, there are so many people in Siberia and the Urals who are like, I mean, there's nobody left, and so they are a small number of people, or in far north there, far east. So I don't think so. I don't think, although there were efforts by some minorities within the Adyghe people, like Ubykh, for example, because there's some Ubykh living by the Black Sea, and they're not recognized, and they even their names were changed, you know, and so of course nobody speaks the language, and they tried, but no, Russia just doesn't want to agree with that. As for organizations, yes, there is an Adyghe and a Circassian organization, the international one. There are many others, like on a European level, in the United States, or including Canada, also like all American. And again, you see the difference between these organizations that were created and exist today in Russia, which are very, very loyal to the Russian regime, of course, and very cautious, and such organizations that are more politically active and radical and critical that are abroad. And yeah, it's a tension that is always there. Yes, it exists. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I remember that we were in the same panel in G16 in Linköping, and I had this interesting conversation with you then.
Oh, that's right, I remember, yes.
Yeah, yeah, I find your research really interesting. Anyhow, I was interested in how you mentioned epistemicide, and I was wondering, is there any case at all of how can I think of how to express it? I'm thinking that you probably have what you could see as ancestral knowledge that's specific to your people and maybe specific to the place where you have your roots. And I was wondering, is there any interest in that knowledge at the same time, or is it like purely epistemicide? Do you understand? Like sometimes I find that there's like a special interest in that type of what can be seen as traditional knowledge about nature and all this. So I was wondering, is that, or has there only been like pure epistemicide, or
it's interesting that for a while I thought that it was complete, and I felt really bad about it. But little by little, slowly, you see that it's changing. And there are people who remember, even if it's oral knowledge, you know, just passed from generation to generation. And apparently now, as you can see,
thank you, in this project that I was showing you for children, yes, younger generation of people, they want to do this. You know, their parents couldn't, because in the Soviet times it was not possible, of course. And even if they wanted to, they would rather hide it from us. My father, for example, he was afraid of talking with me about that because it was dangerous. You could go to prison for that, you could lose everything. But now they're not afraid, and there is for example, a cosmological and ethical system of Adyghe people which is called Adyghe Habza. And this is different. It's not connected with religion, it's not Muslim, it's pre-Muslim. It's actually connected with this druidic system of beliefs. And it's very popular. There are a lot of people studying it on different levels, not studying in this objectifying bad Western way, of course, but themselves being indigenous people and, kind of trying to revive all that. It's that, and it's also a lot of minor projects, a lot of storytelling and a lot of oral histories and interviews. And I really would like to do more of that before it's too late, in the sense that there are people dying. So you have to do it before it kind of this generation goes away. For example, if you compare this situation in with my people with Chechens, then you see the difference between us, and I think the Chechens are even in a worse situation, because several times in recent history the links were completely cut off. Like, the generation that remembered what was before World War II, they were deported en masse by Stalin to Central Asia, and when they came back it was a different country, and they remember deportation. But those who are now in power don't remember, because they were not part of the story. But then you have a new generation that remembers the recent Russian campaigns against them and bombed out Grozny. But there is no connection and there is no history left, so to say, except in people's stories, except in this kind of oral histories. And that's why it's so important to keep it somehow, And interestingly enough, who does it in the most interesting and creative way is the artists. The younger generation of artists, who are like 35, maybe sometimes even younger. They do a lot of interesting projects that might look on the surface as if it's conceptual art and modern art and contemporary art, but in fact it's not. It's decolonial art, of course, because they work with this decolonization of memories and knowledges through different embodied memories, through different objects sometimes, through different ancestral bodies that I mentioned. So I don't think it's a complete epistemicide. And plus we have the diaspora. We have this 4, 5, 6 million, nobody knows how many actually, Circassians living in the Middle East and in Europe and in Canada. And they are sometimes amazing because they preserve more and they remember more than we did, or we kind of allow ourselves to do in the Caucasus. So yes, there is hope.
I figured that from the image you showed under the tree. So I was meaning more if there was interest from the outside, or if it's only from within, that there's a...
Yeah, sorry, I didn't explain very well because I didn't have enough time to think about my question. But I was meaning more whether there are people from outside, like say organizations or companies or
like
governments.
what kind of organizations? NGOs or what?
Yeah, I was thinking like in terms of when you can see with other indigenous groups how their knowledge about nature becomes something that's seen, how it's used in negotiations and I can see like in one way it kind of permeates the or indigenous people as carriers only of traditional knowledge, like you were talking about how you cannot talk about culture that way, how it's always transforming and how you can't talk about it as something static. But yeah, so it was more that I was thinking about whether, but maybe it's too soon. Maybe you're still kind of figuring out.
Well, I don't like progressivism. It's too soon or too.
No, but you see what I was getting at.
I know, but the problem is that you have to know the context, the political context, in the sense that if you're doing it in Russian Federation, almost all of what we're discussing now is criminal law. Because if any organization comes to do that, it will be tomorrow called a foreign agent and banned. And anybody connected with it go to prison or lose their jobs, So it's really bad. It's that bad. So you can't imagine, for example, a foreign organization going there and doing any kind of research project even with them. It's all problematic because researchers are not even let into archives, But all of it is possible outside of Russia. And that's why I think these projects are more vibrant now in diaspora. And I think that if there is any hope, it will come not from the Caucasus itself, but from outside, unfortunately, because the Russian Empire was very successful in its brainwashing and, kind of making everybody afraid forever. So yeah, unfortunately, politics and geopolitics step in here.